My name is Mariah Stopi. Thank you for watching my critique. The study I got was Spirituality and Spiritual Caring, Nurses' Perspectives and Practice in Palliative and Acute Care Environments. The authors were Susan Ronaldson, Lillian Hayes, Christina Agger, Jennifer Green, and Michelle Carey. So, what is the significance of the problem regarding spirituality? The first thing is that nurses' individual spiritual perspectives, experience, and education have been recognized to impact the delivery of their spiritual caring and to influence their ability to practice spirituality as well. The intended outcome of this research was to raise the profile of spiritual caring by nurses and to make it more prevalent. Spiritual caring has long been identified as a difficult area for nurses to articulate, and the difficulty is due mostly to the fact of the vague nature of spirituality and to a general lack of universal language to define spirituality in nursing and to describe spiritual caring. The purpose for the study. It was to identify and compare spiritual caring practice by palliative care and acute care registered nurses, to determine any correlation between nurses' spiritual perspective and their spiritual caring, to investigate any perceived barriers to spiritual caring, and the study will add to the conceptual understanding of spirituality and spiritual caring in nursing by analyzing these concepts through nurses' own experiences and their knowledge. There were 6 research questions in this study. The first was, do perspectives of spirituality differ between palliative and acute care nurses? Do registered nurses practice spiritual caring in palliative and acute care environments? Does spiritual caring practice differ between these two groups of RNs? Do registered nurses' perspectives of spirituality influence their practice of spiritual caring? What barriers to spiritual caring are experienced by registered nurses in palliative and acute care settings? And do registered nurses' spiritual perspectives and spiritual caring practice influence barriers to such caring? There was no identified theoretical framework or conceptual model in the study, but I found that the middle range theory, spirituality in nursing, that was discovered by Malungulu and Hughes, was appropriate for this study as it was linked to clinical practice and research. The research demographics. The study was performed in 7 inner metropolitan health services in Sydney, Australia, including 1 community palliative care service, 3 palliative care services or hospice centers, 3 acute care hospitals. There was a total of 42 palliative care registered nurses and 50 acute care registered nurses. Previously, palliative and acute care environments have not been compared in any other studies. The inclusion criteria for the study were registered nurses from hospices and community palliative care services and registered nurses from general surgery, orthopedic, medical, and coronary care units. Exclusion criteria for the study was anyone that is not a registered nurse and those working in settings other than acute care or palliative care. Nurses working in high dependency units in acute care facilities were invited to participate in the study, but none were recruited for the study. And the design was a cross-sectional study. It compared registered nurses from acute care and palliative care settings. In order to protect the participants' rights, contact was made initially with their directors of nursing services to discuss the research and obtain their consent for nursing staff to participate in this study. Also, ethics approval was obtained from institutional ethics committees prior to the commencement of this study. The variables in intervention. The independent variables were registered nurses working in both the acute care and palliative care setting, The dependent variable was the spiritual perspectives and spiritual caring practice that was done by both of those registered nurses, and there was no intervention used in this study. Data collection and measurement. The data was collected over a 6-month period and interpreted using both descriptive and analytical statistics. There were 2 validated tools used, the Spiritual Perspective Scale and the Spiritual Care Practice Questionnaire. Also, a socio-demographic survey was used to collect data about the participants. The Spiritual Perspective Scale measures a person's view on what they consider to be spirituality, the impact that spirituality had on their life, and their engagement in activities that are spiritually related. This tool was valid because typically religious people scored higher. It has been tested on a wide variety of adults, both healthy and sick, and it was also used on nurses from a variety of specialties. It used the Likert scale from 1 to 6 with 10 items to measure to get the results. The Spiritual Care Practice Questionnaire measures the frequency of assessment and interventions related to spiritual practice and the barriers to providing spiritual care. It was valid because it was reviewed for content and questioning clarity by a panel of experts. This also used the Likert scale from 1 to 5 with 9 items to get this score. These tools overall measured spiritual perspectives, including saliency of personal spirituality, spiritual views and engagement in spiritually related activities, and spiritual practice, including assessment, interventions, and barriers to spiritual caring. The findings: there were significant differences seen between hospice nurses and acute care nurses. Palliative care nurses had spiritual caring practice that was more advanced, and their spiritual perspective was stronger, which was a positive relationship that the acute care nurses did not have. Both registered nurse groups identified insufficient time as the most common barrier to providing spiritual caring practice. Patient privacy was equal to insufficient time as a common barrier that was identified by the acute care nurses. The SPS scores were significantly different. Palliative care nurses had a higher perspective score, 4.1, than acute care nurses, 3.7. The SCPQ scores were also significantly different. Palliative care nurses had a score of 31 compared to acute care nurses who had a score of 25. Also, 40% of palliative care nurses scored at or above the ideal mean identified by the author of the questionnaire of 32, while only 12% of acute care nurses scored at or above the score of 32. Palliative care nurses were found to be older and also had more time in their profession, which could be a significant factor that showed that they had more spiritual caring in their practice. Some limitations to the study. The first one was identified by the researcher because acute care nurses were only recruited from a targeted number of environments, and that was to limit the diversity in the study. Another limitation would be the relatively small sample size. Only 92 nurses were used in this study. And the participants were recruited from a single regional area in specific hospitals and palliative care settings. It could have been open to nurses across all of Australia to get some results. The implications for nursing practice: the major ones identified were that spirituality and spiritual caring is an integral part of holistic nursing, and holistic nursing is recognized internationally. Nurses need to increase their own spiritual awareness and identify aspects meaningful to them in order to become spiritually reflective and apply it during their practice. More education on spirituality needs to be done in hospitals and reinforced often. Also, nurses need to make sure to document their spiritual caring provided and discuss it with their colleagues. These were my references. Thank you for watching my critique, and please make sure to leave me comments on the discussion board.